let's try it again. Good morning.
Good morning.
There we go. Thank you. Welcome to the Wilson Center for this wonderful discussion we're going to have this morning on U.S.-Iran relations and opportunities for the new administration. On behalf of the Middle East Program and the Global Women's Leadership at the Wilson Center, I would like to welcome you here. I'm Gwen Young, and I'm the director of the Global Women's Leadership Initiative. And this conversation is a part of our highlighting and showcasing the women that are in government office, that are representing governments, that are leaders, and that are negotiating critical issues in today's environment. So we're very honored to have with us today the Right Honorable Catherine Ashton, the Baroness of Holland, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, and our own Vice President for Scholars and Academic Relations, Rob Litvak, to talk today about Iran, the challenges and the opportunities that the new administration faces. I'll start with a quick introduction of our speakers. I'm sure you know them well, but I find it's nice to sort of set the stage a bit. To my left, farthest left, is Ambassador Wendy Sherman, who is a senior counselor at Albright Stonebridge Group and a former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She's a senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the Aspen Strategy Group. Ambassador Sherman led the U.S. negotiating team that reached the agreement on a joint comprehensive plan of action between the P5+1, the European Union, and Iran, for which, among other diplomatic accomplishments, she was awarded the National Security Medal by President Barack Obama. Prior to her service at the Department of State, she was vice chair and founding partner of the Albright Stonebridge Group, counselor of the Department of State under Secretary Madeleine Albright, and special advisor to President Clinton and policy coordinator on North Korea, and assistant secretary for legislative affairs under Secretary Warren Christopher. Earlier in her career, she managed Senator Barbara Mikulski's successful campaign for the U.S. Senate and served as the director of Emily's List. Ambassador Sherman has served on the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, was chair of the Board of Directors of Oxfam America, and served on the U.S. Department of Defense's Defense Policy Board and Congressional Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism. Ambassador Sherman, we are honored to have you with us here today. Sorry for my papers. Baroness Catherine Ashton, in the middle here, is a life peer in the House of Lords. In 2008, she was appointed as the first woman to be a British European Commissioner and became the first woman Commissioner for Trade in the European Commission. She concluded the South Korea trade deal, opened the Canada negotiations, and resolved some long-standing disputes with the USA. In 2009, she became the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and won praise for her work as a negotiator in difficult international situations, particularly for her role in bringing Serbia and Kosovo to agreement in 2013, and in the P5+1 talks with Iran, which she led for 4.5 years. And I just learned she's a rock star in Iran right before we came on stage, so we should add that into your bio. She's received numerous awards for diplomatic work, including the highest diplomat honors from the King of Jordan, and most recently from Germany. Together with the Prime Ministers of Serbia and Kosovo, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by both sides of the U.S. Congress. On leaving office, she was awarded the Grand Cross of St. Michael and St. George by the Queen. Last week, she received the Presidential Medal from Kosovo. And she's a Woodrow Wilson Scholar and member of the Global Leadership Foundation, and she's just been appointed the first woman chancellor at Warwick University in the United Kingdom. We're honored to have you, Baroness Ashton. Rob Litvak, who will moderate the conversation, is the Vice President for Scholars and Director of International Security Studies at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where you are now seated. He served on the National Security Council staff as Director for Nonproliferation in the first Clinton administration. He was an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and has held visiting fellowship at Harvard University Centers for International Affairs, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and Oxford University. Dr. Litvak is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and received a doctorate in international relations from the London School of Economics and has just published a book on Iran and North Korea. So Rob, I'll turn the conversation over to you, and welcome to have you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gwen, and good morning to all of you. I don't think my mic is on. And I recall, one time at a meeting, Henry Kissinger was being introduced, and the moderator said, "Can everyone hear me?" And Henry Kissinger from the side said, "By definition, those who cannot hear you will not reply." So I won't ask, can everyone hear me out there? I think, I hear that they've ramped the audio up a bit, so take two. It is an honor and pleasure to moderate this morning's conversation with Baroness Ashton and Ambassador Sherman, distinguished diplomats who played central roles in achieving the landmark nuclear deal with Iran that constrains that country's capabilities. The agreement now is being implemented against the backdrop of continued tensions with Iran over its regional policies and the inauguration of a new president who has inherited a deal that he was openly hostile to as a candidate. We'll discuss these issues for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. Let's begin with the agreement itself. Wendy, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, runs to 109 pages with 5 annexes. Can you just briefly take us through its main provisions of what you achieved through this landmark agreement?
I think for purposes of this discussion, what's most important is what, from a U.S. policy perspective, President Obama insisted that we do, is to shut down all the pathways to fissile material for nuclear weapons so that Iran could not obtain a nuclear weapon. And as most of you know, there are 2 basic ingredients in terms of fissile material: enriched uranium and weapons-grade plutonium. So we had to shut down those pathways in terms of the facilities, the technology, how Iran moved forward, both in uranium and plutonium, and at the same time close down any possibility of creating a covert supply chain of those ingredients. So the agreement, which is, and I use agreement in the American context, I'm not supposed to because it has a legal meaning, but I will use it for vernacular reasons here. The agreement has incredible amount of technical detail to constrain what Iran can do and to ensure that the verification by the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is quite profound. And most people feel that this deal ends somehow after 10 years. It does not. The verification and monitoring mechanisms that are in place go on for a considerable period of time, and as long as Iran subscribes to the additional protocol of the IAEA, they cannot have a nuclear weapon. So Iran made an agreement to do all of the technical things necessary to ensure that the pathways to fissile material were closed down, a covert supply chain could not be established, and the P5+1 in the European Union agreed to lift, which in English means suspend, in Iranian terms means end, which is why we use the word lift. One of the things one does in diplomacy, language matters. But to lift sanctions that applied in the nuclear realm, but not sanctions in countering terrorism, not sanctions about human rights abuses, not sanctions about proliferation, not sanctions about weapons transfers. So this is a political agreement. It is not a treaty. It will be sustainable and durable as long as it serves the interests of all of the parties.
Thank you. I'll use lift in yet another connotation, which was this was a heavy lift. So congratulations for achieving it. And you mentioned agreement and harmonization of terminology. Kathy had mentioned to me yesterday that this was non-trivial, that getting all the words to line up in 6 or whatever languages you were working in. But that really opens the door to the broader question that I'd like you to address, Kathy, which is the process. Describe kind of how did we get to yes with Iran?
So the process was under the Security Council, and it is, because it's called the P5+1 here, it's a permanent 5 members plus Germany. The reason for that was that the negotiations that had begun 2003 had been the British, the French and the Germans initially. So they would argue that added into that was the United States, China and Russia. So it's P5+1, E3+3, it's 6. Doesn't make any difference. And the EU was designated to play a particular role, which I think grew over time to become a kind of coordination role. I don't say it was more than it was, but it was what it was. And we, over time too, developed a particular way of conducting the negotiations that was, in my view, unique to the situation. So when I started, it was a process that was infrequent, short-lived, and we transformed it to being a regular process that lasted for several days, or could last for several days. Not because we wanted all to spend time together, though that was occasionally fun, but actually it enabled us to do both the political side and what was really important, the technical side, because this was an incredibly technically complicated agreement that required a lot of experts to burn the midnight oil, both at the talks and back home in the different countries, but I would argue especially here, to make sure that what we were talking about makes sense and that we hadn't missed something, because that was incredibly important in closing down these pathways. It also enabled us to spend time slightly more informally. I used to begin the talks with a dinner or lunch with Foreign Minister Zarif in later times, but I'd done it with Dr. Jalili beforehand, which was partly to break the ice each time, to find out what mood everybody was in, to discuss not the detail, but the kind of process of the days ahead. And we worked through, in those days, all of the issues that we could until we were exhausted, fed up, or we'd run out of time. And we did that over a period of several years.
I mean, you both have conducted bilateral diplomacy. This was a multilateral forum, which poses its own challenges. Could you just talk a bit, I mean, you're dealing with the P5+1. These aren't like dealing with all other NATO members or states with which there's a kind of congruence of interests and values. You're dealing with China and Russia. Can you talk about the P5+1, the kind of the multilateral negotiations that went on to reach a consensus? And did Iran try to pull a diplomatic end runs, like reaching out to the Russians to try to lobby for different terms that they could sell in the P5+1? How did you manage that process?
Wendy says I should start this, so I will. So one of the most important things I felt was making sure there was no daylight between any of us. And we worked incredibly hard to make sure that there was a common position. It didn't mean that there was not emphasis from different countries on different things. The French, for example, would have aspects of the deal that they were particularly concerned about. And there was a spectrum of opinion about how much we had to do, as you would expect. But the Iranians got to learn that it didn't matter whether the Russians wanted a bit less, or the Chinese wanted a bit less, or the French wanted a bit more. What mattered was that they had to agree to something that everybody on our side could sign up to. And over time, I think the cracks that I'd seen initially between the different positions more or less disappeared, because even if some countries would have settled for less, they knew there was no deal unless everybody got what they needed, and that became the standard. It gave the Iranians, in a sense, greater certainty that if there was an agreement, and my job was to kind of hold in my head the position of all, that they could be sure everybody would sign up to it, but there was no point anymore in trying to pick off one country against another.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I tease, and some of you may have heard me say this before, as the person who led the U.S. team, though obviously President Obama, Secretary Kerry, and Secretary Moniz were the real leaders, and certainly Kathy's counterpart was first Secretary Clinton and then Secretary Kerry. It was a very complex process. We had negotiations inside the government, so I negotiated in our government. Then I negotiated bilaterally with each member of the P5+1, and then with the P5+1 as a group, but often with the Europeans first, and then with everybody, knowing that the Chinese and the Russians were consulting with each other, and then with all of us. I negotiated with Israel and with the Gulf countries on a regular basis before and after every session, and with the Israelis on every technical detail. They were incredibly helpful, even though they reached a different political decision at the end. And then occasionally, and certainly negotiated with the US Congress, which we briefed staggering numbers of times. And then occasionally we negotiated with Iran. So doing these takes an extraordinary amount of time, and we we both had other jobs. That's the thing to remember here. I mean, Kathy was the high representative for the European Union. She traveled all over the world. I was the undersecretary. In the 4 years I was undersecretary, I went to 54 different countries, many of them several times, was responsible for every other region in the world and every other crisis that was going on. So the weight on us and the weight on the teams, who also all had other jobs, nobody did just this, was really extraordinary.
Yeah, I see a cottage industry opening for the two of you, multitasking for corporate executives. One of the striking aspects of the deal, and it was really kind of a threshold determination, was that you would focus on the discrete nuclear issue, that you weren't going to draw in other issues of concern like Iran's support for Hezbollah, et cetera. That seemed like a pragmatic call, and for, as our former president would say, for a host of reasons. Can you discuss how you got to that point? Because I think it also opens the door, and we'll get to it in a few minutes, is that one of the criticisms, and I think kind of an off-the-mark criticism of this deal, is that it was just a deal, not a grant buy. It didn't include all this. So you have the incoming criticisms like, yeah, but they're still mucking around in Syria with Hezbollah, et cetera. So, Wendy, how did you see that?
This publicly before, at least from a U.S. perspective, at the beginning of this negotiation, the countries in the region said to us, do not discuss other issues because we aren't in the room. Yeah. So you can't negotiate our future if we aren't there. So just focus on the nuclear issue. I think as it got closer to maybe happening, they started to get increasingly worried that there wasn't a broader security agreement about how we would work to stop Iran's nefarious behavior in the region. There was concern that because sanctions were lifted, that all this money would pour in, and the Iran Revolutionary Guard Corps would have just billions of dollars to do even more bad stuff. And so what were we going to do to make sure that didn't happen? So I totally understand the anxiety. That's why President Obama, from a U.S. perspective again, held a meeting at Camp David of all of the GCC, had regular conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Secretary Kerry followed up with a meeting in Doha. New security arrangements were agreed to between us and the Gulf countries, and with Israel, obviously, before Obama was done, a new memorandum of understanding of assistance to Israel in terms of security. So it's all understandable, but it was not just our decision, it was the decision of those in the region as well. And I think, Kathy, I assume you had the same experience.
That's right. We were under a mandate from the Security Council. The job was clear. It said our job was to build confidence in the purely peaceful nature of what Iran was up to in this context of its nuclear program. And that's what we did. It's all it does. It doesn't do more than that. It wasn't designed to do more than that. And as Wendy says, if we wanted to go broader, we weren't necessarily the right people in the room anyway. And so we did this. Now, our ambition and hope was always that if you can make one agreement and build some trust and confidence in what you're doing, it can lead you to other places. You can have other conversations. You maybe can do other things. It doesn't always work like that. It may not work like that in this case, but it's a hope. But unless you can deal with this particular negotiation and deal with it in a way that does build that confidence, in a sense, in that time when we did it, you couldn't move on to anything else because that was the big thing that everybody rightly was deeply concerned about. And putting that to rest for, as Wendy says, much longer than people think, is a really important precursor to having any other kind of conversation. But we stuck to the mandate we were given, and as you rightly say, Wendy, it was clear that other countries outside did not wish us to start engaging in broader questions that really affected them and not the people in the room.
The one other thing I would add, and that I've said to all of my Gulf colleagues and to others in the region, is that as difficult as Iran is in the Middle East, if they had a nuclear weapon, their ability to project power into the Middle East and to deter our and our allies and partners' actions would be profound. Right. So this had to come off the table to be able to tackle the other issues. It just had to.
Yeah, I think there have been a couple of lines of criticisms of the deal when it came out. You know, for those who were calling for the better deal, and one was that it didn't address these other concerns, which you mentioned, and that Iran, once it came into compliance with its nuclear obligations, got access to funds that had been held in escrow for the sale of Iranian oil. Their funds, exactly. And it wasn't some kind of ransom. It was basically the international community, tied these funds up, but these were, it was Iran's money that was returned to them once they came into compliance.
And just for the record,
yeah.
Robert, because it's really important for an American audience, $150 billion has been thrown around. That's not accurate. There was maybe $100 billion of Iranian assets in foreign banks. Of that, our Treasury Department, our intelligence analyst, believed that about 50 billion of it was available. The other were non-performing loans or Chinese loans. And of that $50 billion, many analysts believed most of it would stay in those foreign bank accounts to be used for commerce.
And,
That's not to say the IRGC wouldn't get some more money. We always said they probably would.
Yeah. A third element of the criticism was under the kind of the better deal rubric was like, why couldn't you get a deal that kind of fully rolled back the program to zero centrifuges? And the day President Obama walked into the White House, there were already 9,000 centrifuges, I think, operating at Natanz. So zero was never was not an achievable objective. I think it's a criticism that's out there, but it didn't take into account kind of the situation that the Obama administration inherited in 2009.
But I'd be careful about that even. I mean, remember the mandate. The mandate was, can we produce an agreement that you can all be confident means they can't build a bomb? Yes, we did. Yes, it does. Now within that framework, you're trying to do a negotiation. And a negotiation means that you have to, on both sides, reach agreement. It's not about the imposition of what you might ideally want in lots of things and lots of ways on one on the other. Right. It has to be a workable formula. But the workable formula has to fulfill the mandate, and it does. And that, for us, was where we started from and how we did it. And there are people who don't like aspects of it. My thing about a jigsaw puzzle, you put the pieces together, you get the picture, but the pieces may not be the pieces that some people want. The point is the picture's right. The picture gives you the confidence. The pieces will change in a negotiation because that's what they do. And although there is criticism here, it's quite interesting because there's a kind of deafening silence everywhere else. I didn't even go on the BBC because 24 hours after the deal was done, they'd lost interest in the story and said, oh, we don't need you anymore because it's kind of, that's happened now.
The Iranian, there was something, a deal involves, an agreement that both sides can have a narrative and their interests are addressed. The Iranians retain a constrained program, but we have assurances, as Wendy said in her discussion of the deal, that their access to weapons usable material is blocked off. So that's sometimes hard to explain, in the public messaging of the deal, but and when seen kind of bumper sticker versions of the criticisms under the better deal, rubric.
Right. I think the other thing is that President Obama understood a very fundamental reality. The Iranians had mastered the entire nuclear fuel cycle. We could bomb away their facilities, but we can't bomb away knowledge. Yeah. So they would have been able to recreate those facilities and probably would have done it in secret and underground. So, he understood that, and it was critical.
Another key determinant, or a key determinant of success in the negotiations was Iranian domestic politics. As they say at the Wilson Center, please put your phones on vibrate or stun. A key determinant of success in the negotiations was Iranian domestic politics, particularly after President Rouhani succeeded Ahmadinejad in 2013. The nuclear issue in Iran is a proxy for a more fundamental debate in the Islamic Republic over its relationship with the outside world. Iran's unresolved identity crisis over whether it's a revolutionary state or an ordinary country. We've really benefited at the Wilson Center through our Middle East program, and particular thanks to Haleh Esfandiari. We've had excellent meetings on Iran's domestic politics to inject that aspect into the U.S. Public policy debate. But what were your perceptions of the struggle within Iran from your perspective as negotiators? And how did you have to take that into account?
Well, I started with the Jalili-Ahmadinejad negotiations for the first, I think, 2 years. My God, can't believe that. Of trying to persuade them that we were serious about a negotiation and that this was something that was actually, if you like, in their interest too, for all sorts of very obvious reasons. And when President Rouhani was elected and we changed over to Minister Zarif, it was a completely new world in all sorts of subtle and small ways. We stopped having endless debates about which country on the planet we were going to do the negotiations in. I went to Baghdad, Kazakhstan, Moscow, Istanbul with the Ahmadinejad regime. We settled on Geneva and then Vienna with Zarif, who just as long as it was a UN place, just wanted to be in one place for all the obvious reasons. And that was the first indication of seriousness. Secondly, we discovered, of course, everybody spoke English, which was interesting. And they could text, which we didn't know. And all sorts of ways in which the communication started to improve and increase. And a real sense, I think, from the beginning, in the very early discussions, that they'd sort of rolled their sleeves up and were really interested to see whether it could be done. Didn't mean it would be done, didn't mean it could be done, but they were certainly interested to try and achieve that. And we saw that, or I saw that, as a link to President Rouhani's desire to get the Iranian economy into better shape, a commitment he'd made as a candidate, and I think the essence of why people had really wanted him to be there, and a sense that this program was not helping Iran's place in the world. Now, you can argue lots of other things weren't as well, but it was certainly for me those two things that I felt were changing in the context of what the negotiations would do. And they then started to gather momentum and I think moved to the, first of all, interim agreement. You could see that possibility for the first time.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's the times with Jalili, it was all in, they would speak in Farsi in set pieces and we would speak in English in set pieces, and we would each put our maximalist ideas on the table and get absolutely nowhere. And much to our surprise later on, Abbas Arachi, who became Helga Schmidt, Kathy's deputy's counterpart and my counterpart, was on the Jalili team. We never knew he spoke and wrote perfect English. And he then ended up being the lead with Majid Ravanchi in the second round when Rouhani became president. And the hours that Helga had to spend on Bagheri, who was Jalili's deputy, deciding where we would be weeks in between negotiating rounds because Helga was on the phone for hours negotiating the city. And Baghdad is the most extraordinary story. They decided to go to wanted to go to Baghdad, and we thought, really? Really? But we decided it would be another month before we'd get back together again if we didn't agree to do Baghdad. But the P5+1 and European Union colleagues both had issues in scheduling commercial flights in and also security concerns. So everybody met in Amman, Jordan, except the Iranians, of course, who could easily come into Iraq, and came in on U.S. airplanes into Baghdad. It was wild.
It was wild because we then got stuck, if you recall, in a
sandstorm.
sandstorm. So we're in a sandstorm in a hotel where all the alcohol's been taken out because of the Iranians, and we can't leave. And the optics on the bar are empty. And I remember thinking, this is hell. And I'd had this very, very, very long bilateral with Dr. Jalili. And I remember looking out the window and it was just orange outside. The British ambassador lived next door and we woke him up.
Away.
We just managed to get into his house where we got a few bottles of wine out, I'll tell you. And then eventually we got a flight out, which is famous for one thing for me, which is complete silence on the plane, everyone's exhausted. But I'd been watching American Idol,
Yes.
and Wendy just turned to me and went, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, he won," which was Phil Phillips, who I thought was fantastic. Everybody's wondering what on earth we're talking about.
Right.
So,
Kathy Ashton and Wendy Sherman both watch American
American
Idol.
Idol, yeah.
It's mindless, you know. When you do the stuff we do, listening to wonderful music is a great thing.
Yeah.
And never let it be said something new is not discovered at a Wilson Center meeting. Okay? We're in year 2 of implementing the long-term agreement. The Trump administration has indicated little appetite for jettisoning the agreement, but could take actions that would undercut it. And moreover, the broader context remains a factor. It may be difficult to insulate the nuclear agreement from the broader issue of U.S.-Iranian tensions in the Middle East. What do you see as the major challenges moving forward?
I think that there are 2 challenges. There are challenges we have, and there are challenges Iran has. This is, and as I think Kathy has said accurately, the Europeans, this is less of an issue for them at the moment. But the president had said he would rip up the deal. He has since pulled back from that statement. He has waivers that he has to sign off on in April, so it will be a telling moment. There are discussions going on in Capitol Hill about sanctions given the activities in the Middle East, particularly Iran's engagement in backing the Houthis in Yemen and support for Hezbollah and what they do in Syria and threaten Israel on a regular basis, and Iran's own activities in the region, as well as ongoing concern about the future of Iraq. So many things could upend this. I think that there are some, probably more on the Republican side than the Democrat side, would like to put enough pressure on so that Iran pulls out of the deal, as opposed to us being responsible for it. In Iran, which Hala knows better than I do, there are equal pressures. As Rouhani comes up to his election in May, I suspect he will be reelected, but nonetheless, you already see, as we were discussing before this, Minister Zarif, making a statement about how we're watching and the U.S. must comply and we'll resume our program in a minute, and we have done more technological design on advanced centrifuges and we are great and everything will be fine. And this will increase, these tensions will increase in the run-up to the election, and the Supreme Leader wanting to balance all of the forces in Iran, because there are politics in Iran, even though we like to think there aren't because they have a Supreme Leader. There are. Will get much more intense, and politics here will get much more intense. So right now, people are more or less, all parties, complying, but one never knows.
Anything to add to that, Kathy? Or just
Only that, there are huge concerns about what Iran is doing, and rightly so, and it does require the international community to work together. But the Iran negotiations were a good example of the international community doing just that. And I hope that when any one member of that team, in this case a really important member, but nonetheless one member, the United States, decides to think differently, that it will talk to the people with whom it did the deal. Because it wasn't easy for anybody, and we demanded as the team of each country that they would fully participate, and they all did, even if at times, at the same point as we were negotiating with Russia in the room, Wendy and I were outside the room, as were the Russians. We were putting sanctions on Russia about their conduct in Ukraine, and yet they continued to be a full member and to play their part. So did we. So it's important, I think, if international negotiations of the future are going to get a chance, that it's not something where you just unilaterally decide to do something different. That's all I would say. And I hope that that will be a conversation in the team that really did do this deal, because I think the methodology of an interesting and diverse team, though really tough when you're in it, actually is something that I think we shouldn't lightly throw away. And I think for the Iranians, they need to be very conscious that their world is changing, and the world they're looking at is changing all the time. And they're going to have to think about what they do in the context of a new administration here.
Finally, yes, finally, before we go over to the audience for questions, during the many years you were engaged in these negotiations, was there any particular moment that will stay with you as a lasting memory, other than breaking out the claret in the British Embassy in Baghdad.
It wasn't claret, they didn't have any.
Okay.
And I wasn't there, so I don't know what they drank.
Okay.
I was still in the back with the
But any kind of
T-bar.
humorous or poignant moment of, or a moment when you had a kind of eureka, like, hey, this is really going to happen?
Well, there's so many moments.
Okay.
It's hard. You know, the sandstorm in Baghdad was certainly a particularly crazy moment. It was surreal, actually.
Yeah.
Needless to say, when at the end we had an agreement, we were at a facility in Vienna that is a UN facility, and all the ministers were sitting around that table, and everybody had a +1. John Kerry had a +2 because Rob Malley was from the White House, so he was there too, besides me and the Iranian delegation on the other side of a U-shaped table. And no press, nobody else was in the room, and each minister talked about what this deal had meant, and every one of them was really eloquent, really eloquent. And John Kerry was last, and he, you know, used the talking points we had written for him, as we did for all the ministers. I'm sure Kathy's team did for her as well. But then at the end, he said, you know, when he was a young man, he went off to war. And at the age of 21, he came back to the United States and really rallied against that war. And that his purpose in life since that young man was to try to ensure that there would not be war ever again. And for him, that's what this was about. And there was utter silence in the room. You know, everybody's eyes, including the Iranians, were filled up with tears. And then everybody applauded. And it was an incredibly powerful moment, because I think people understood the gravity of what so many people for so long, and you know, Kathy was there for the early days before I was in this, when it was just so brutal, so brutally difficult. And then it certainly was brutally difficult the 4 years I did this, so it was quite a moment.
Okay. Over to you now for comments, short comments or questions, ideally, and we'll start with Barbara Slavin.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Ladies, pleasure to see you both. Is there one particular thing that you would change about the agreement if you could have, that you think would have made it more solid and more bulletproof in a way against criticism? And I'm also interested in your views about the possibility of building on this. I won't say renegotiating, because obviously that's not in the cards, I think everyone agrees, but building on it in a non-proliferation context so that when those sunset dates come in farther down the road, there'll be a way to deal with that and make it stronger. Thanks.
Do you want to start?
You start.
Okay.
You start.
I don't think, you know, it's foolhardy to say I would have changed this or changed that, because of the point that Kathy made, which is it's a puzzle. And even if you may not like individual pieces, they have to fit together. I always used to use, as you know well, Barbara, because you covered this, as a reporter, the Rubik's Cube. You can get all the pieces to fit in, but if you can't get that last one to click into place, it doesn't matter. And reporters would ask me all the time, what are the odds? And I'd say it's binary. You know, you either get there or you don't get there, and you can get 99% of the way there and you can't get the last 1%, and it doesn't happen. And there were many points along the way to the last day that it could have fallen apart. So no, I can't answer that question because of the point Kathy made about the puzzle. I think people will certainly talk about whether there are things one can do in the future. But I think, quite frankly, having those conversations now are not particularly productive. We need a track record of compliance for a while so that the deal really has feet and is anchored. 1 year of compliance is a very good thing, but we've all seen how fragile deals can be.
Yes, sir. Speakers can just identify themselves.
I'm Benjamin Tour, retired diplomat. Given the title of this discussion, opportunities for, I think it's, well, for the current administration in U.S.-Iran relations and Baroness Ashton's reference to the importance of the enhanced communications when the Rouhani team came in. I'd like to ask your thinking and your ideas on two things and the likelihood of these things happening. And one would be the assignment by the U.S. of diplomats to its interest section in the Swiss embassy in Tehran. And second would be the value and likelihood of a incidents at sea agreement, given the many troublesome incidents that have occurred in the past and are likely to continue in the future. Thank you.
I think before I answer the U.S. specific, it'd probably be valuable for you all to hear if you would, Cassie, a little bit about how Europe and the European Union has positioned yourselves with Iran.
Yeah, I mean, so the situation in Europe is different. This was for all sorts of historical reasons, which I completely understand, and also current reasons, less of a major debate in the European Union. We stood completely and utterly with the negotiations, not least because I spent a lot of my time doing that, but also in being determined to work very, very closely with the US on sanctions. And we did, and we held very firm and expanded sanctions from time to time and so on, very much as partners. And that remained throughout. And that continues to be incredibly important to the European Union because it's a good example of a collaborative approach that worked. And I think for all of us, the ambition, as I've said, was within a very detailed and constrained negotiation that was to do what it was to do. The ambition, in a sense, was greater in the minds of, I think, everybody around the table, that could this be done, maybe, just maybe, it would open opportunities to do other things. But you're not going to see that until, as Dr. Romano, who has been here in Washington the last couple of days, as head of the IAEA, has been saying, you know, the best way to make the deal better, he said, is to continue with the compliance and continue to monitor it. So confidence grows with continuing compliance on both sides and continuing determination to make it a strong and important agreement. So for me, without getting into the detail of US policy, which I wouldn't dream of, it is about, if this works, and it seemed to work, and it does what it's supposed to do, which it will if it continues in the way that I believe the IA believe it's going now, then maybe that creates opportunities to think about other arrangements or other agreements that could be of value.
You all have embassies, though. European members, and the European Union has a dialogue with Iran, yes?
We do. Some have embassies, some don't, as in many countries. I think the EU members of 28, shortly to become 27, have, I think, only 2 or 3 countries in the world, of which this is one, where all are represented. So they're represented through the EU as well. So yeah, we have embassies, and when I visited Tehran, we did not have an EU embassy, but I was able to use the national embassies.
So to answer your question from a U.S. point of view, I don't see, particularly under the current administration, us putting Americans in an intersection in Iran, and I don't think Iran would welcome that. I think Americans being inside of Iran are not something that the Rouhani administration wants, and doesn't want Americans actually working in Iran. We are still the great Satan. Bill, I understand there are different forces and some who do, and there are Americans who are in Iran, so I agree with you on that. But quite frankly, we have also seen Americans, and certainly dual citizen Americans, who end up in Evin prison, as Hala did. So it is a riskier proposition for Americans than it is for many nationalities. Bill, as many of you know, knows Iran quite well and has been and has worked very hard to try to build the relationship between the United States and Iran. So do I think there could be a sea agreement or other opportunities like that? I certainly think we should look for those opportunities. I certainly think that one of the things that came out of this for the U.S. was a channel of communication. I hope Secretary Tillerson continues that channel of communication. When our sailors were taken, they got home in 24 hours because John Kerry could pick up the phone and call Javad Zarif and say, what gives? So, you know, they have very direct conversation. And that is meaningful and important.
Thank you. Steve Landy, Manchester Trade. 4 issues took place under the Obama administration, all issues which in history and tradition will be very positive. Obviously, Obamacare, obviously trade and the trade agreements that were reached, obviously Iran, and the 4th one will come back. Yet, what happened in this campaign was that every one of those agreements were vilified. And yet, as soon as Trump becomes president, he begins heading to the middle. You explained Iran. What amazes me in trade policy, the area I follow, is that his big change is negotiate bilateral instead of multilateral agreements. Diane Negroponte had an excellent discussion yesterday in Mexico, and we're into the wonk issues. How do you deal with digitalization? How do you deal with new issues and so on? My question is, how do we prevent the political party or the candidate of the political party, who may be the same person who negotiates, how do we prevent them from taking all this criticism during a campaign because they made the necessary compromises to come to an agreement, and yet assure that we don't have the negative side, which is all negative, get reelected, and then even worse, perhaps do the same thing the person, the guys from the good political party would have done. How do we get a more positive political reaction to all the work you did? The reaction in Washington's fine. How do we get it outside the Beltway? Thank you so much for an absolutely increased knowledge of a subject that I thought I knew everything about. Thank you.
I think that's an excellent question, but they would say in NATO, it's a bit of out of area for us right now. I mean, it's, you know, we talked about challenges over the next 2 years, including in the U.S. domestic, you know, context. I don't know if Wendy or has anything to add to what was said about that.
I mean, I think Kathy, as a politician in the House of Lords, can probably speak to how you communicate as a politician, but it's never easy. And in our country, I would say, sir, any place you're traveling in the United States, have these conversations. You know, this can't just be done from Washington. And every young person who has come to me and said, what do I do now because I'm not going into government or I want to leave government, I've told them, leave Washington. Go to a state, work in a state legislature, work in a city, talk to normal people, and people who have to figure out their day-to-day lives and explain to them what's going on and why we did the things we did. I don't know if you have a perspective as a politician.
Well, I'm not, I like to think I'm not really a politician. I just find myself being one. But yeah, I think, you know, the challenge of anything as complicated as this is that, not surprisingly, it's very difficult to understand all the detail when you're dealing with it all the time. If you are not watching this agreement, or you are simply dealing with things in your domestic life or in other ways, you're not getting into the details. So it comes down to, in a sense, what you think about those who are doing it for you and the politics of the time. And so much of what I see from a distance as criticism of what was done is not always to do with the agreement, but to do with what you think about the people who are leading, what you think about the President Obama and his administration and his, if you like, his relationship or attitude to America in the world. It's not about how many centrifuges. It's not about what happens at Natanz. It's about perception of the people who are doing things for you. And often in politics, it is about how you feel about the people, because you're not ever going to follow, unless you're in Washington and a bit of a policy wonk, which I suspect quite a lot of you are here. But more generally, you're not going to do that. You're going to see talking heads on television arguing about something, the detail of which, not because you couldn't understand it, but because you haven't had the opportunity, or you're not going to take the time because it's not part of your daily life. It is about how you feel about people. And sometimes we forget that in politics, it's about you having confidence and trust in the people who represent you. That's what's going to build agreements of the future, is do I believe that these people speak for me? They won't do everything I want, because nobody can. But they can do a lot of what I want, and they're trying to do the best for me and my country.
Last question, because we're just about out of time, but I can't resist. Today's focus has been understandably on Iran. Both of you are integrally involved in setting an important non-proliferation precedent, constraining capabilities. And the front page story this week, and as it's been in recent months, has been North Korea's moves to develop a really extraordinarily mature capability. And I was just commenting to a colleague, when I got into this business decades ago, I could not have imagined North Korea developing a capability which, if on current trajectory, could be approaching the level of 1/2 the size of Great Britain's nuclear arsenal by 2020. So, and I'll start with Wendy, because I know in the late second Clinton administration, you were involved in an initiative that held real promise on the ballistic missile side in particular. And I think I heard President Clinton say that he thought he'd left basically an agreement that was close to being coming to fruition, something for the George W. Bush administration to take on. But having worked on both cases, and I know, Kathy, you've had interaction with the North Korean foreign minister. So any sense of, is there a useful precedent here for applying to this other hard case that we're focused on now?
I think there are some precedents. I used to think, and I still do, every case is sui generis, of course. But there are some lessons to be learned. One of the things that we did from a U.S. perspective is we used every tool we had in the toolbox on Iran. The negotiations were absolutely core and critical. But so was working with the European Union and others to enforce sanctions all over the world. And we had teams that traveled worldwide to make that happen. It was using intelligence capabilities in appropriate ways. It was arraying our military forces in the Persian Gulf. It was the President of the United States commissioning and deploying a weapon that could get to the underground facility that was once secret in Iran, to say to Iran, we can destroy your facilities if you want. It was to put in place economic sanctions, both multilaterally, unilaterally, and always in concert with Europe. So it was extraordinary. It was all hands on deck, all pieces, all tools, arrayed in a way, because sanctions never stopped Iran's nuclear program. As you mentioned, at the beginning of Obama, there were 9,000. When we were negotiating, there were 19,000. And yet it was the most extensive sanctions. Sanctions alone will not stop what North Korea has done, and now they have nuclear weapons as opposed to Iran, who never had them. But I do believe there is a shot if we array all our tools. And the other thing I would say is that in the case of Iran, the United States in particular, because of our secondary economic sanctions, working with Europe and the SWIFT mechanism, which Europe controls, we had a profound impact. In this case, the United States cannot have that same profound impact. It is China. And so very, very considered discussions have to happen with China. And I hope some of them are happening. So it is the most dangerous, the most challenging, much more difficult than Iran, I believe. But I don't think any administration has arrayed all of our assets, all at the same time, in a coordinated, integrated fashion, not just by ourselves, but with all of our partners around the world, to see if we can get North Korea to not believe that nuclear weapons are the way to regime survival, but they have to make a choice between nuclear weapons and regime survival.
I mean,
Nothing
just
to add to that, or?
well, only to reinforce what Wendy says about the interlocking of all of the tools in the toolkit with the partnership that you create. And what we did on Iran was unique and needs to stay that way. You can't replicate that and have success, but you can take the lessons of it. It took a long time, it took a lot of people working on things. It took a lot of different pieces to be pulled together. But it took partnership. And what was really the most interesting thing of all for me was how we developed this team of countries who played significant roles, each of them, differently, but nonetheless significantly, in getting us to where we had to get to. And that we confronted, if you like, the people we were negotiating with, not in a, I don't mean confrontation in necessarily a hostile way, but with a determination that we were sticking together and we were a team to achieve this. But what we were trying to achieve was very clear and very precise. And it didn't stray into some of the things that would have been even more difficult, and where the Iranians, for example, would have said, you're after regime change and so on. We were doing what we were doing. And so elements of it, when you think about North Korea, the team you'd need to put together, the interlocking pieces, the capacity to send the same message over and over and over again from people who are sometimes unexpectedly being tough, which is also important. That maybe has got some resonance for how you might go about tackling the problems today.
This has been a rich discussion. I'd ask the audience to join me in thanking our speakers for their comments today and their extraordinary service.